Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Lluberes. So, as Dr. Lluberes said, my name's Cesar Lluberes, and I'd like to present what our objectives are here. So, the objectives of this talk are to present the perspective of a child psychiatrist training and working in the Philadelphia region, particularly in the mental health emergency room. So I spend a lot of my time moonlighting at the Philadelphia Children's Crisis Center. So I just would like to give a perspective of what I've been seeing in the last year while working there. I'd like to present some statistics on the changes in presentations of the children accessing care during the pandemic and suggest some recommendations along the way of how we may be able to alleviate some of these stressors and just familiarize ourselves with these stressors and how we can help these kids now and in the future. So are the children safe? So this is part of the reason why I thought this was such an important talk. So I posted this article here on the left side. It's from something I looked up from March 2020. As you can see, it's dated March 23rd, 2020. And it brings us back to this time of confusion, some of it which still remains, what was going on. It seemed like things were changing on a weekly basis back then. And we thought, the children were safe. You see here in the article, it says parents trying to protect their children from the disease can take solace in one thing. The disease has generally been milder in children. And although, that remains true, the reason I wanted to do this talk was just to shed light on all of us as physicians, that the children really haven't been safe. This pandemic has really affected the children's mental health in a way that it's going to take years to really figure out. So after a year working in the crisis center, I can tell you the kids really aren't doing well. Many of us put our hopes and we took solace in the fact that these children, they weren't the ones experiencing the severe illness we were hearing about. They weren't the ones dying of COVID. Many unknowns have remained in how the virus affects children, but children were not the ones who we were talking about fighting for their lives as the disease spread and fear spread and these hospitals were reaching capacity. We made a collective decision to shut down schools just a little bit over a year ago today, right? Overall, worldwide, 1.6 billion children were at one point out of school. And we were initially saying, it would just be a few months. I remember what was it, 15 days to stop to flatten the curve. And here we are. Here in Philadelphia, most public schools and charter schools have remained fully virtual. The Catholic school system, they've gone in person for quite some time now. And even those choices that leaders have faced in the past year, whether to open schools or not, opening business and such, it just reminds me of the extremely complex choices that states, leaders, and all of us have had to make over our safety and our economics. Some seemingly carry on while others are much more stricter with their guidelines. How confusing this all remains. I'm sure we all wonder how will this catch up to us economically. I know I do. As a physician, I wonder how this will catch up to us physically and mentally. According to the National Allegiance of Mental Illness, 50% of all lifetime mental illness develops by age 14 and 75% develops by the age of 24. So this is what I'm talking about children. The CDC, recent statistics that they've put out says that 63% of people ages 18 to 24 reported anxiety or depression, with 25% reporting increase in substance use to deal with stress and 25% saying they'd seriously considered suicide within the last year. So as I go on with this talk, I just think to myself, what a privilege I have to be able to speak to and to help guide children and have personal relationships with the children that I treat every day and their families. How can we as physicians help during this time? I think acknowledging and organizing the confusion in our own minds is the first step. So what is the Philadelphia Children's Crisis Center? So as I said, I work there quite a bit. It's a mental health emergency room for all children and teenagers under the age of 18 who may be experiencing a behavioral health emergency. All Philadelphia County 302s, which are involuntary commitments, they go to the crisis center for evaluation. We're the only place in the city that that like police and approved 302s get sent to for disposition. There's also the mobile crisis team during emergencies in children, and they help guide children to different hospitals, for evaluations. Both of those resources are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Who goes to the crisis center? Involuntary commits, as I said, voluntary children looking for evaluations. The age of consent in Pennsylvania is 14 years, so anybody 14 years and up can sign themselves in, or the parent can bring them in for an eval. Typically, it's designed for someone to go get an evaluation. It usually takes a couple of hours, and if the disposition, as determined by the psychiatrist, and agreed to by the family, if the disposition is inpatient, typically it's designed to be, it's an outpatient emergency room. You're supposed to disposition the child to an inpatient hospital within less than a day. But due to the volume of children seeking help, both now and in the past, sometimes that lasts a little bit longer. Sometimes there's kids there for several days. But I'll present some statistics on that. A lot of times back before the pandemic, when schools were open, there were a lot of school referrals that were sent there. So if the child was having some kind of behavior issues or suicidality in school and there was some concern, there was a lot of school referrals where they'd have to go and get an evaluation before being allowed to return to school. That, needless to say, has definitely decreased during the pandemic. So the overall volume has decreased of the amount of kids that we're seeing there. So what do the statistics tell us? So this is from the Fair Health white paper. It was published March 2nd, 2021. Fair Health is a nonprofit which examines healthcare costs and health insurance information through research. It's CMS certified, and it studied the effects of COVID-19 on the U.S. pediatric mental health. It looked at everyone ages 0 to 22 years old, and it looked at 32 billion private healthcare claims. And so this was from January to November 2020, and it compared the same months in 2019. So it's investigating overall mental health, intentional self-harm, overdoses, substance use disorder, diagnoses, and reasons for ER visits, as well as state-by-state variations. So these are some of the statistics, and you can see intentional self-harm increased 90% in March 2020 and 99.83% in April. So a big change in percentage there. In the Northeast, which is our region, right, in August 2020, it saw a 333% increase in intentional self-harm. And I think that that's right in line with what I've been seeing as a fellow, both in the emergency room, in the consult service. So we, as Jefferson fellows, we do consults in the Moors, a lot of overdoses, even in very young kids. 12 years old with ingestions. And at the CRC, I see a lot of referrals for that once they're medically cleared for evaluations. So this is just a graph of what the statistics from the Fair Health white paper showed. So overall, their message was that overall claims have decreased, and that's similar to what I've seen in the crisis center. Again, the overall presentations to the crisis center have decreased, whether that's from school referrals or people just being more cautious about going out, especially to an emergency room where they can get exposed. But what it shows is that the percentage of mental health conditions has increased, as you can see from this graph, just a very large increase in that. So I want to show you some of my own statistics here. So these are this is some data that I mined myself from the billing in the crisis center. So I just compared a few months, because if I got into all of the months of the year, I can talk for 5 hours for all the different factors. But I took August, which is generally a busy month, and I took March, half of March anyway, because that's all that I could get to this year, right? So this is just an example of the numbers that we've been seeing. So in August 2019, we saw 167 kids. In August 2020, we saw 165. So similar numbers at that point. And here's just the percentage of recommendations for acute inpatient stay. So in 2019, you had 38%. Where in 2020, you have 49%. So you see an increase there. The crisis stabilization unit, that's like a short-term inpatient type of setting, also an increase there, as you can see. Partial hospitalizations increased. Just the overall numbers is 81 acute inpatient referrals to 64 in 2019. So you can see that there's a definite increase in the acuity level of what the children are going to and the stressors. Also, I had mentioned the average stay in the crisis center once you disposition them to inpatient. In 2019, you see it was 1.08 days, whereas this year it's been 1.65 for many different reasons. One being that a lot of the children's inpatient hospitals in the city, they've been totally filled to capacity for many months at this point. This is just a visual representation for those of us that are a little bit better visually, to just see some of the changes between 2020 and 2019 in August. And then here's the numbers for March. So similar trends here. Acute inpatient in March 2020. Again, this was I just took the first half of March. So Philadelphia Public Schools, they closed, I believe it was March 15th last year. So this is from March 1st to March 15th. Acute inpatient referrals was 22% in 2020, whereas in this year it's 42%. And you see the sheer number of presentations. In 2020, you had 214. This year, again, the volume is down. It's 130, but you see the numbers. Even with 130, you have more acute inpatient recommendations. Same thing with the crisis stabilization unit. So I thought that was an interesting stat that I'd share. Just again, highlighting the acuity of and the stressors that children are going through. Again, for the visual learners. So what are the challenges and complex differences? A lot of discrepancies in resources, computers, and accessories. So how long, I wondered when we went to fully virtual suddenly in the middle of March, how long did it take for families to get computers and pick them up in the transition and learning for these children? How many computers did you need per household? How much internet, how much bandwidth did you need? How many broken keyboards did you go through when the kids are on the computer, they're eating, they're drinking? I know in my house, I've bought several keyboards this year. And how much do those keyboards cost? You know, they can be expensive. So some of these families that are all virtual, how are they dealing with these stressors, and how do the kids fall behind in school with that? I have to tell you, school presentations and children falling behind, that's probably been the number one stressor. It's typically the number one stressor when you're seeing kids in the crisis center. I'm failing school. I feel behind. I feel like I'm in a hole I can't get out of. And now I feel like that's just very common. It's like the number one story. That and phone access and the way that they're interacting socially on the phone, and whether their parents agree with that or not. And that's something that Dr. Chandy will get into a little bit more detail. So this plays into the economic advantages and disadvantages of family. It makes me think of something that we can all relate to is when we were all looking for masks early in the pandemic. You know, the World Health Organization in March 2020, they said there was a fourfold increase in the price of masks at the time. So how much were we paying for masks, and like, can people that have economic discrepancies, could they afford those masks, and how did that play into their fears and fears that remain even today about safety? Then there's structure about the home. Do these kids have their own office? You know, do they have their own room where they can actually listen to their teacher and their classes and learn in a good environment? You know, some of my colleagues, they give me examples, and I've heard many examples of kids, they have to go into the closet in order to get some privacy, whether it's for class or in their therapy session. That you hear the noise in the background. I'm sure we've all had those experiences with telehealth. So like when you call your patients, what does it sound like in the background? When they're in class, what does it sound like? When they have siblings that are also in class, do they have headsets? Can they afford the headset? How often do these headsets break? And again, this comes into like economic questions. So these are questions that I ask in all of my evaluations just to get the whole picture. You know, I ask, like, are the parents working from home? Do they have an essential job? Are they alone at home during school? What kind of supervision is there? You know, a lot of times I hear like teenagers, many times I've had presentations where you have like a later age teenager saying like they're so stressed out, they have to monitor what their brother or their sister who's in elementary school is doing in class, and they're failing. And they also worry about what role they have in the success of their siblings. So that's also a very common stress that I've been seeing in the crisis center. Who's getting snacks for these kids during break time? You know, who are they getting meals? Are they making their own meals, or are they eating hot dogs 6 times a day? Um, so the all of these things, they obviously have implications for both educational advancements and mental health. It kind of um, brings to it reminds me. So Dr. Luber, our program director, he always like tells us the certain recommendations for all of our evaluations, and one of them is quality time with the family, right? So at the end of these like very hectic days, I always make sure I recommend for just a brief period of family time, and usually that comes in the way of like picking a book that everyone can kind of enjoy together and kind of settle down before bed. But when I give even that recommendation, I find a lot of challenges all the time with parents actually implementing that, or having the time or discipline to implement that. So it's something that I'm constantly repeating, and it makes me wonder, like, how much more of a challenge is it having to supervise your child during their school day, 5 days a week at home or 3 days a week at home. So I try to bring attention to this and to the parents, and emphasize that it's not an easy thing, and that you understand that as a clinician, but you always try to encourage that and repeat that. So hitting the pandemic wall and children coping. So kids, they have a basic framework of processing disappointment. The longer the pandemic and disruption, the more difficult it can be to continue regulating themselves. And that's definitely the trend that I've been seeing in my own personal experience. Dealing with abstract pandemic restrictions, I just wonder how kids are dealing with this all. I mean, I, I, I want you all to think about how adults have been processing this pandemic. Has it been difficult for them? How difficult has it been to implement simple rules, whether you agree with them or not? How difficult is it to get everyone on the same page? How important is a mask? How important is social distancing? So adults have struggled with this, things that we think are basic concepts. What are children's minds doing when they're processing these things? It's a big stressor for them. Um, and I wonder if it's like right now with all of the stress and the ongoing stress, if it's something like a grief process, right? Like a Kubler-Ross, right? The stages of grief. I wonder if kids right now, if they're stuck in the anger or the depression phases of this isolation, this grief, this loss of a whole year of their lives. Um, Different families, they have I asked about different factors, such as like, can they go outside? Do they go outside? Are they living with their grandparents? Are they living with people with chronic health conditions? Do they live in a house or an apartment? You think about how the pandemic has increased the crime rate in Philadelphia, right? 50 homicides just in January 2021, a 32% increase from a year ago, the deadliest in 30 years. Are these parents, are they going to be relaxed, letting their kids play outside, even though they've been stuck in a house for a year? These are some of the discrepancies that inner city kids are facing all over the country. Just recently on the news, there was a shooting of 9-year-old girl for which her father and her 12-year-old brother were charged. So it's a very sad situation. And something that parents are always thinking about when they're making decisions to let their kid out, not just about them catching the virus from other kids, but something bad happening to their children to add to their stress. So I always ask the kids, like, what do they do for fun? I never realized until this year how many kids draw and paint. That's got to be one of the most common responses that I hear, but okay, I'll take their word for it. They love drawing and painting. So that's usually a response I get from the female patients. Maybe it's just a guarded response. With the males, I hear a lot about video games, and video games have become such a big way of social interaction for the kids. But then I ask myself, how many PlayStation 5s do they have in their house? I know I couldn't get one. I still can't. Uh, but how many PlayStations are there in the house? How many siblings are there? So that's limited. Remember the toilet paper shortage? So it's the same thing with the PlayStations, even now. Um, I remember when it snowed this winter, I went to try to get my kids a sled so they could at least enjoy sledding down the hill. You know, there were no sleds anywhere, not even on Amazon. You couldn't get a sled. These poor kids, they couldn't get a PlayStation. They couldn't do anything all year, and they couldn't even get a sled when it snowed. These are some of the factors affecting them. So it's been a rough year for the kids. So that leads to children being in the house, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, they've discussed the importance of diet and sleep health, and that's another thing we see all the time. One of the most common complaints with my outpatients is the sleep hygiene is all over the place, and we know how that affects school the next day. You can't if I don't get sleep, but I'm pretty grumpy the next day, and I can't concentrate, and these are the things children are also dealing with. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, they highlight the importance of assessing food insecurities, access to healthy foods, and educating family about community resources and hygiene and exercise as well. If the kids are sedentary, the kids they're missing out on their sport teams, just the whole year, of school sports or community sports. So that's something to think about as well. So here I have just a graph about just something I took from an article about how states have taken different approaches, and we all know that. And I think about the kids presenting to the crisis center. Oftentimes I wonder, like, is acute inpatient and showing up to the CRC, is this the only contact that a lot of these kids have with other children? It is in a lot of cases. They sometimes they prefer being in the hospital over being at home, or they have different stressors, whether it's the neighborhood or families. Uh, I've heard kids say very sad things even in the crisis center. Again, going back to the confusion about this whole pandemic, I've heard kids say frequently, "The world is ending." They think that the world is ending. So how sad is that? Uh, uh, I hear kids say, "I wish I could go back to school." When did we ever think that kids would say they wish they could go back to school so frequently? I hear it all the time. Even kids that hated school, they just wish they could just go back just for the social connections that they have. I have kids that they're failing virtual gym. How do you fail virtual gym? These are the challenges, because virtual gym might be just watching a video about tennis. Um, so just very sad. Um, and it's something that I always think about and empathize with the patients, particularly the kids transitioning, like the eighth graders, right? They're graduating, they go into high school now, they're in ninth grade, it's their first year of high school, they haven't stepped foot in the building, they have all these expectations for high school, and those things are all washed away. So very difficult, and it's important to ask and help the children understand that you understand what they're going through, and give them some kind of hope. Um, I think about the differences in just development from when you're in elementary school. We all remember elementary school, when you go to a classroom, you're walking in line, you're with the teacher, you're supervised all the time. And a lot of times when you make that jump to middle school, you get the freedom of like walking to different classes. So that's like a developmental process. The same thing with high school. You have the different classes and different schedules. These are things that kids have not experienced this year. I wonder how that'll affect them in the future. Missing graduations, missing proms, right? We know how big a deal prom is. College applications. Can you go visit the campus right now? They're missing that, making these important choices. So here's just a graph that I thought was interesting, just kind of to wrap up. Um, These are the percentage by states, right? As of mid-March, this is an article that I saw just yesterday. As of mid-March, Florida leads the nation with 100% of its school districts operating fully in person, followed by Georgia and then Nebraska. And I thought this was interesting. So the image on the left was from the report I had cited earlier. And it's the overall mental health claims as a percentage of all medical claims, right? And then you have on the right the percentage of school reopenings, fully open and in person. And there's like a bit of a correlation there. Again, like, this is not like a statistical analysis, but I just thought it was an interesting visual. how in the southeastern states you have the open schools, and it's the percentage of mental health claims are a little bit less there. And again, we can go back and forth for hours talking about the differences, and there are many differences and factors, but regardless, I thought it was an important slide. And what are the ongoing challenges? As I've mentioned, the kids, they're going to have difficulties conditioning them to go back to school. What are the challenges after being at home for a whole year? Even the kids that want to go back to school, that's a stressor. They're going to be stressed making that adjustment again. So that's something that we have to consider and think about. And what's going to happen to the kids that haven't been attending school? There's many of them. They're in truancy. They're failing all their classes. They have to catch up. The schools are kind of asking, like, do you want to hold this kid back? Are they repeating the grade? And I, as a child psychiatrist, talking to a lot of children every day, I don't think that that's clear yet, based on my interactions with parents. So is there going to be summer school? That's something that you have to stay tuned for. What will colleges do? What will they say? I've seen many kids, National Honor Society students, that are now failing in crucial grades, 11th grade, 10th grade, where their performance is being evaluated. And I just wonder how that'll affect their mental health moving forward. And here's just a little funny meme about this kid. This kid hasn't gotten out much since he was born. He insisted on being pants for Halloween. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Chandy.
All right, thank you so much. Let me also just point out that since we may be strapped for time, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them after my set of slides are done. And just to be clear, my set of slides are going to be very light. So let me get started. Today, I just conceptualize this as an adventure. We'll begin with some observations on the emotions that everyone can relate to in the material and immaterial world that we live in. Then we'll look at some pros and cons of screen time and during the pandemic. And finally, I'll share a bird's eye view of what the current research has found and give you some key takeaways to wrap it all up. So psychiatry often deals with how the physical world affects the psyche. So I start with what was going on in the physical world. So as we all know, COVID-19 had engulfed the world in a pandemic that is unparalleled in recent history, leading to an unprecedented global lockdown. Along with the lockdown, we also saw politics, sensationalized news coverage, racial and governance issues come to the spotlight. In other words, we saw an increase in the chaos in the physical world. Now let's observe some of the emotions that arose internally around us in the psychological world. The first of these emotions is fear. I've represented some of the fears that may arise related to the COVID-19 pandemic as dragons. The invisible virus can be associated in the mind's eye as a fear of that which cannot be seen, and therefore depicted as the fear of the invisible. Also, another fear that has come around, and we see it manifested in various forms, is the other dragon, represented as a primitive and tribal fear of the other or the outsider. The social distancing measures have worsened fears related to being lonely. The fear of abandonment is very real for a lot of kids, especially if they know of sick and elderly relatives struggling with poor health at this time. As children, we first looked at our moms when faced with this fear of the unknown, and later also towards our fathers. Today, government authorities tell us there are many unknowns about this virus, activating a very primal fear that is hard-coded in all our survival instincts, the fear of the unknown. Also, kids look at parents who are uncertain about the future due to various reasons, and this could bring out a fear of the future. The next issue everyone has experienced is that of waiting. In some sense, it is like our life has been put on pause and we are waiting and waiting and waiting some more. The next is a loss of control that is felt. Kids tend to feel a loss of control when they feel like they don't have a choice. Even adults are experiencing this today. Imagine the situation of adults with elderly parents. They're in a catch-22 situation. They want to make sure that they don't accidentally expose their parents to the virus, and they also don't want their parents to feel abandoned at this time. The next one is boredom. Kids and teens have been quite vocal about this if you've known any of them during this time. Finally, we get to the elephant in the room, social isolation. Humans are social beings, and this may be one that most kids and adults struggle with. Some postulate that today, if there's a fear of missing out, tomorrow there may be a fear of going out. Now, the usual response to fear is a fight or flight. We see this manifested among some kids and teens as aggression or avoidance behaviors. Waiting. Waiting only ends when there is fulfillment or gratification. Since that is not possible, the mind seeks out anything that gives a temporary sense of fulfillment or gratification. The behaviors that are easy to perform and provide immediate gratification are the ones that are preferred. The most common behaviors that could become problematic are binging behaviors, eating, drinking, gaming, internet browsing, shopping, or even watching TV. To get over the fears of being out of control, kids attempt to avoid these emotions by distracting themselves with any activity that gives them a sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. This is one of the allures of video gaming. Why sit with one's feelings of loss of control when you can escape into a fantastical, imaginary world where you can be whoever you want to be? And boredom. The interesting point is that when bored, we don't stop engaging apparently in mindless or pointless activities, but instead take on more and more. For example, when binging on one TV program feels pointless, we start binging several programs simultaneously. This is not limited to TV. We notice more behaviors that seek to satisfy our boredom, such as online shopping, online gaming, online arguments, offline arguments, more rethinking of our lives, all in a Sisyphean effort to hyperstimulate ourselves. Ironically, the effect of these added activities seems to be more boredom. Social isolation. The cure for social isolation is seeking more social connection, preferably online or, if possible, in person. This brings us to the common thread that runs along all of these stress responses: the ubiquitous screen and the time that is spent staring at them. So there are plenty of positives of screen time use, and the first I'd say for a social being is socializing. It is one activity that kids and teens engage in using screens. Some of us have been able to adapt to remote working and learning to a fair extent, others not so much. But have you noticed that many of the relationships or friends we see among our groups pre-existed the pandemic? My point being that it's just not easy to build trust with someone we have not met in person. We've seen schools and teachers adapt them for education.
I am Mackenzie Adams, and I am a third-year kindergarten teacher. The number 4. Oh, I see Bryn is holding up 2 and 2. That will also make 4. I see 4 and 0. That is 4. What kind of pictures do we see over on our number 4? Can you raise your hand? Grayson, go ahead and turn your microphone on for me.
So we've seen entertainment value in seeing how kids are expressing themselves creatively.
Chicken wing, hot dog and bologna, chicken and macaroni, chilling with my homies. The B, it's M to 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 the B.
Stack up the Legos. Do you want stack up Lego?
And more importantly, the screens are fun, easy, and exciting to use. This is a recent challenge that is going on. It's called the Cuddle Challenge. So let's talk a little bit about the negatives of screen time use. One of the fears that are happening nowadays is the fear of missing out, or FOMO, which is really a modern take on our innate need to belong to a group, a need which traces all the way back to our earliest ancestors that formed social groups for survival. Nothing sets you up for constant comparison with your peers like social media. That's where the issue of online influencers who put on a filter on everything and make their lives look larger than life. Studies have found that high FOMO scores correlate with increased Facebook use, even when people find using social networking to be stressful. So it may be a vicious cycle. You kind of feel FOMO, so you check your social media, and that confirms what you feared that you were missing out. So you feel your feeling worsens. The other issue with this is when there is a lack of parental oversight, it can lead to oversharing, privacy concerns, ID theft, exposure to detrimental content, including violence, criminal behavior, sexual content, risk-taking stunts and challenges, glamorous depictions of substance use, cyberbullies, online predators, and recently targeted advertising at children. A lot of today's tech companies have found ways to stimulate the feeling of that kind of social interaction to get you to spend more time on their platform. Some of you may have seen this interesting documentary on Netflix.
That's not by accident, that's a design technique. What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
The other issue with screens is that when you're using your screen, you are missing out on doing something else in the real world. This is known as the opportunity cost of screen time use. If you're not paying for something online, then you probably are the product that the big tech companies are using. Screens are notorious for promoting a habit of fractured focus. This is by design in order to keep us coming back to it when we physically are not in front of a screen. This could be the reason lots of kids and teens are failing their classes during virtual schooling. While they're in virtual school, there's a fractured focus causing them to want to do something else. And the most fun thing to do is just play a game or scroll your social media feed. The other issue is with worsening social skills. There's a idea of absent presence, where it's a phenomena of being physically present with people, but paying more attention to a device. And in addition to this, sometimes we notice poor habits related to sleep, lower grades in school, less time with the family, and not enough physical activities. A rare issue that also we need to keep an eye out for is problematic use, where salience, where the child's entire motivation is around getting their next dose of screen time. Mood modification, when access to screen time is needed for mood regulation. Tolerance, when the child needs more and more time to reach the same level of satisfaction. Withdrawal, when there's severe behavioral dysregulation, when the screen time is not available. And conflict within themselves and towards others worsens with frequent use. So what does the research actually say? So there's this interesting research that was done in the US, and these are this is a summary of what they found. So there's a whole lot of information that you can see if you go to their website, Common Sense Media. So UNICEF actually conducted a study in 2017, which was an evidence-focused literature review, which came to the conclusion that it was largely inconclusive with respect to the impact on physical activity. But it also showed that digital technology was beneficial for the children's social media relationships. In terms of impact on children's mental well-being, more robust studies suggested a relationship, a U-shaped relationship, when you have kids who are not using any and excessively using it, there is a negative impact, and those who are using it moderately seem to have a small positive impact. And this other study that I've mentioned below the one on the left, it's done what is known as a specification curve analysis across 355,358 data points. Because what they found was that a lot of the research in this particular area was showing up a lot of false positives. And their research also ended up showing that there was a negative but small difference in association between digital technology use and adolescent well-being. So across the pond in the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health in the UK, they came out with a guide for clinicians. And what they found was that there's a lot of studies which are saying that screen time is causing obesity or mental health problems or educational failures. And there's a lot of that going on. But they also mentioned in that same study that they admitted that the evidence base for direct toxic effect has always been contested. So they did their own systematic review of reviews and by Neza and al. And they took 940 abstracts with around 12 systematic reviews meeting their inclusion criteria. Based on this evidence, they came to the following associations. Children with higher screen time tend to have less healthy diets, a higher caloric intake, and more pronounced indicators for obesity. Children with higher screen time, particularly over 2 hours per day, tend to have more depressive symptoms, although it has been found by some studies that some screen time is better for mental health than none at all. So both these studies across different areas have come to a very similar sort of conclusion. So what's going on? What's wrong with the research? One explanation is that technology is growing at a rate faster than which research can keep up with. Another explanation is that lab research is not correlating well with real-world use. And of course, the elephant in the room, most research looks at screen use in typical settings, and the current pandemic has turned typical use upside down. So there's an interesting ABCD study, Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is looking at 10,000 9 to 10-year-olds and following them into adulthood. And screen time data is among that which is being collected. So going forward, we might get a better picture on what's going on. Finally, I have takeaways grouped into a section of 3 blocks. All of these takeaways are based off of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's recommendations. So the first is in terms of age. So, if you have kids less than 18 months, no screen time unless it's for some sort of video chatting with an adult. If it's between 18 to 24 months, what they say is that you need something called co-viewing. That is, you have an adult and it's an educational experience of some sort. For kids 2 to 5, limit non-educational screen time to about 1 hour during weekdays and 3 hours on weekends. And for kids 6 and older, the recommendation is just to encourage healthy habits and limit activities that include screens. As far as parents are concerned, we would recommend that they learn to use parental controls, learn about what is appropriate content for their kids, make rules about screen-free zones and times, for example, during family meals and outings, avoid using screens as pacifiers, babysitters, or to stop tantrums. And sleep is important. Recommend all screens are off 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime. And of course, each kid is unique. Be wise when you allow your child to have their personal device. And the last set of recommendations are, there's no one size fits all. Consider your child or teen's maturity and habits. And sometimes the right recommendation for one family may not be the right one for another. Be aware of advertising and how it influences choices, and role model your own safe and healthy screen time habits so that your kids can see that you are, walking the walk. Teach kids about being a good digital citizen. Talk to your child about what they are seeing. Point out good behaviors such as cooperation, friendship, and concern for others. Make connections to meaningful events or places of interest. Encourage your child to learn other activities such as sports, music, art, and hobbies that do not involve screens. Encourage screens in ways that build creativity and connection with family and friends. And that is the end of my presentation too. Thank you all for your attention. And if there are any questions for Cesar and me, this would be a good time.
I just wanted to say thank you guys very much for your presentation, kind of a thoughtful look at some important areas, especially now during the pandemic experience and during the past year, the frontline look, and then what we have to be concerned about in regard to screen use for developing children and adolescents. I'll shut up, let some questions come through.
I just wanted to say thank you for the talk, because it was a really nice overview and well articulated description of what I think a lot of us are seeing, but it was sort of all in one place and so clearly laid out. So thank you.
One thing that I think is important to be thinking about for clinicians working with children is kind of like some basic sort of health recommendations. So I'm wondering for you both, as you're thinking about the needs of children, especially during the time of the pandemic and the shutdown, what kind of general health sort of considerations do you usually get into with your families and kids?
So,
oh, Cesar, you go first.
Yeah. So as far as general health, you mean like physical activity and nutrition, or do you mean like behavior strategies?
Really, physical health, nutrition, exercise, screen time, how to handle, the stress of being in, all those different things. I mean, there's a lot to go on here, but I'm wondering what you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, with physical activity, of course, I always try to make sure that I have the kids understand, and the parents, of course, understand that they need to be out. They need to be taking a walk, at least going outside. They don't have to go out with friends and hang out in the park with everybody if the parent's not comfortable. But definitely they have to have physical activity, whether it's just going out for a walk as a family. Sometimes if they have a pet, to be able to go out and make sure that they're walking the dog and getting that fresh air. For other kids, like the teenagers, I try to encourage them to just do any basic exercise at home. Like it could be jumping jacks, it can be sit-ups, push-ups. I get into that actually quite often. As far as with the parents and like behavior strategies, one thing that is really important to make sure you're addressing is the way that the parents are punishing or reprimanding kids when it comes to screen time or video games in particular, right? So I always try to make sure that I'm telling the parents, when you take the phone away or the video games away, which is like the lifeline right now for a lot of kids and has been for a while, I make sure I remind them that when we do these things, we don't want to do it just in spite, as an anger, being the parent. You want to teach them something, right? So I always make sure I remind them, if you take the video game away or their phone, make sure it's a limited amount of time, that the child understands how long that's going to be. And it doesn't have to be for a month. When you take something away for a month from a child, you're not giving them the opportunity to work for it. You're just backing them into a corner. They don't have anything to work for, and you're losing opportunities for a lesson. You're teaching them one lesson for a month, when you can be doing that. You can take their phone away many times. No one's perfect. They might make the same mistake 20 times in that month, and you have 20 opportunities to teach them something. So the shorter the amount of time and the more the kid understands what the consequences is, the better. So I make sure that the parents know.
Sure, we got to get you in here. Few comments.
Sure. The only additional thing that I would point out is that there's a lot of chaos going on, and there's a need for a structure. So the better the parent is enabled to provide structure in terms of activities that they can do during the day, it would be, that would be the best way to go about it. And there's no one size fits all. Every family has their own take on it. So we need to be mindful of that when giving our recommendations.
Okay.
Jerry and Cesar, this is Dr. Lauriello. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I think one of the things Cesar said, which was like, this is going to have long-term effects on kids. I think one of the things I think we might have not appreciated is that we have been, I hate to use the word spoiled, but we've been gifted with about 35, 40 years of not having children worry about illness and disease the way they basically worried about it before then. So in the 50s, it was polio. And before then, there's plenty of illnesses that, wreaked havoc on children. And then we went from basically about the late 60s or mid 60s to now without having really that kind of worry for our children. And I think the pandemic and the coronavirus has woken us up that we're not as safe as we thought we would be. So in some ways, I think kids have to learn what other kids learned for many generations, that the world isn't as safe from a health perspective. But that doesn't mean that they can't grow up to be healthy and happy kids. It just means that we can't protect them from everything. And we certainly cannot no longer say we've protected them from sort of mass spread infectious disease, because we haven't, and we didn't. And we may have another. And so I think we probably, as those of us who had kids during this time, we're not really prepared to explain to our kids or understand that, there are always been illnesses that could take kids and adults. And this is now a new way of life that people have to think about.
Thank you, Dr. L'Oreal. This a nice perspective on that. It's really quite a challenge right now. We're out of time. I want to thank everybody for their participation in Grand Rounds and for what Sherry and Cesar had to offer for us today and to think about as far as our approach with our patients and families. Thank you all.